Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest and welcome to our presentation. In this video, we would like to give some insights into our research project on segregation in early childhood education in care institutions. The project is funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research and carried out in a cooperation between the Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg and the Hamburg University of Applied Science. My name is Stefan Schulder, and I'm a research fellow at the Hamburg University of Applied Science. Together with Professor Nina Hogrebe, our main focus is to reveal segregation patterns in Germany using quantitative methods.
Yes, and my name is Gesine Nebe. I am a research fellow at the Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg. Professor Johanna Mierendorf and myself are applying qualitative research methods in order to shed some light on organizational structures and practices promoting segregated childcare center clienteles.
We will now present findings from our research project with a special focus on the processes and outcomes of courses of action within structural and legislative conditions. Let's start with a brief overview of the content of the presentation. First, we will frame segregation in early childhood education and care, short ECEC, and present our research project, the focus of the presentation, methods, and the data. Then we will present an analytical and empirical perspective of the place allocation process in German ECEC. And finally, we would like to discuss processes and challenges resulting from this. ECEC is believed to support children's individual development and to contribute to educational equality by being especially effective for disadvantaged children. Context studies show that most positive effects are realized in mixed groups, whereas the concentration of children from underprivileged or disadvantaged families disparage learning outcomes. But early education is also considered to serve social inclusion and democracy more generally. ECEC enrollment can be seen as a first step into society, and from that perspective, it is important that children and their families are socialized in context of diversity. Segregation, which can be defined as a result and process of unequal distribution of population groups, counteracts both aims. Despite its relevance, only a few studies explicitly address segregation in ECEC in the German context. Educational effectiveness studies that consider preschool composition show ethnic segregation with differences between 0 and up to 100% of children with German as a second language, for example. Local studies show similar results also for social segregation, but these are mostly conducted in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, a state with a high population density located in the west of Germany. There are indications from educational and social reports that particularly high concentrations of ethnic minority children can be found in daycare centers in urban agglomerations, and that the proportions tend to be low in rural areas of Eastern Germany. Therefore, segregation is visible. But where and why does segregation arise, and what processes are involved? Besides parental choice processes, we suspect influence at the decision-maker level in the allocation of places. So, what happens when a space is allocated? My colleagues and myself are working on finding answers to these questions, among others. The goal of this presentation is to shed some light on the interconnectedness of the legal conditions and actors in childcare distribution, and on the other hand, to reveal this using empirical data on segregation in ECEC. To investigate our research question, we rely on two methodological approaches. In our research project ZOHA, we analyzed data from a total of 35 interviews with youth welfare agencies, daycare center providers, and daycare center managers. In set ID, we drew on survey results from national level data. First, the Early Childhood Education and Care Quality Study in the Socio-Economic Panel, short K2ID. Second, the National Education Panel Study, NEPS. And using both datasets, we are able to make statements about the composition and admission criteria for about 165 to 685 childcare centers.
Regarding early childhood education and care in Germany, it is essential to bear in mind that since 2013, every child aged 1 year or older is legally entitled to childcare. While federal law entitles all children to daycare and state law frames this right accordingly, ECEC in the actual municipality or region lies within responsibility of the municipality. Also, it is important to remember that parents' demand for childcare can, at the moment, not be satisfied, meaning that ECEC capacities are still not quite sufficient. Parental demand for ECEC exceeds child enrollment rates by more than 15%. When aiming an analysis of ECEC allocation and further childcare allocation processes results focusing on segregation, one needs to be aware of the complexity of the childcare allocation process. I will highlight this in the following as what our project coined the ECEC distribution triangle. The schema includes 3 actors. 1, the person entitled to childcare. 2, the legally responsible provider. And 3, the childcare provider. As mentioned, the person entitled to childcare is any child aged 1 year or older. The child is legally represented by its parents. The legally responsible provider is in principle the local responsible municipality in which a child lives, and in consequence, usually the responsible authority, which is the local youth welfare office. The actual childcare center or daycare person, accordingly, is the childcare provider. So, ECEC place allocation procedures are shaped by a triangular structure consisting of the 3 interconnected actors: childcare provider, legally responsible provider, and the legal representatives of the person entitled to childcare. Additionally, it is necessary to highlight that in Germany, childcare provision is organized in a very differentiated system, which means that ECEC is provided for by non-profit as well as for-profit organizations. Some childcare providers are private, while others are public or run by traditional welfare organizations or by the municipality itself. Regarding finances, the system is also rather complex. At this point, I would like to just emphasize that fees vary depending on the provider organization, region, income of the parents, etc. But altogether, childcare provision funding is taken care of by the state and federal state and the municipalities and the legal representatives of the child, and sometimes, in a rather small share, even the child care provider organization. The question is, what does each actor in this triangle actually do or have to do? Let us first take a look at the child. Its legal representatives have to register their need for ECEC with the chosen daycare institution or person. This could be only one, but mostly parents register their child in a few daycare centers or with a few daycare persons. Also, at the same time, and actually first and foremost, they need to register their demand with the responsible authority. Parents document their need for ECEC usually with the Youth Welfare Office or municipality according to its modes and bureaucratic procedures. The legally responsible provider on the one hand, verifies necessary requirements regarding a child's entitlement to childcare, which in fact means checking birth dates as well as the permanent residence, usually drawing on resident registers. With registered childcare providers, the legally responsible provider, on the other hand, contracts childcare provision quantity as well as quality and costs. Usually, municipalities and ECEC providers negotiate refund rates on a regular basis. So, childcare providers act upon contracted finances as well as requirements. Childcare providers supply childcare spots and hence give childcare places to families demanding childcare with them. They do so by concluding a legal contract and officially enrolling children. With the legally responsible provider, childcare providers also conclude contracts, respective quality, quantity, and costs for childcare provision. Regarding the actual child's daycare and finances, providers inform the funding provider and the legally responsible provider about the contract with the family, as well as about the extent of provision and about any occurring changes. After having shed some light on what our project coins as the ECEC distribution angle and highlighting the three actors in it, we hope to have given some insight into the complexity of childcare allocation and distribution. We need to bear this in mind when looking at the outcomes of this process, especially when it results in segregated childcare center clienteles.
The processes that take place in detail between the actors involved are not directly visible or comprehensible from the outside. What is visible, however, are the compositions of the settings according to characteristics from which we can derive segregation. Using descriptive statistics, the available data reveal large differences between the ethnic and social composition of the facilities. The means take values between 16 and 27%, depending on the characteristics. The standard deviations are almost similar to the mean values, and the minimum and maximum values range from 0 to 76% and even often up to 100%. This speaks to clear differences in composition between facilities. For example, the sample thus includes facilities in which no child speaks a language other than German, but also facilities in which all children have a non-German language of origin. If we compare the distribution between urban and rural areas, here's an example with a share of parents with a university degree, we see that in dense areas, more options from which to choose. In rural areas, there are often not many alternatives. That means that dense areas are a precondition for being able to choose at all, as otherwise there are no alternatives. Maya and Coinser have already pointed out this relationship for schools, which can also be transferred to ECEC, especially because of a greater extent of freedom of choice. To choose a school, alternatives must be available, which is rarely the case in sparsely populated areas. In urban areas, there's an increasingly differentiated school landscape with a variety of different school profiles. In summary, high supply diversity and high demand results in more pronounced segregation. In most cases, daycare places are allocated directly by the head of the facility. In order to find out whether and which criteria are used and how important they are, educators were asked to rate admission criteria on a 4-point Likert scale. By far the most important criterion rated by the professionals is that siblings already attend the same daycare center. Important are also the social neediness of the family and the age of the child, followed by the occupation of both parents or at least one parent. So when space is scarce, admission criteria are applied. This means that although there is a general legal entitlement to a place in a daycare center, various selection criteria are used due to an excessive demand, which appear to be of varying importance. As a result, the composition of the facilities is directly influenced by the selection processes, resulting in inclusion and exclusion processes.
While quantitative data can clearly show that, to what extent and where segregation does exist, data does not indicate where or how segregation is actually done. Taking into account the childcare distribution triangle, we would like to highlight some particularities some more, arguing that systematic structures and procedures might actually drive those practices, promoting as well as resulting in segregation. In the next slide, we will give a very small glimpse at our qualitative data and on one of our conclusions, focusing on the childcare provider. We're talking about having to make choices on children and families. We would like to highlight the somewhat paradox situation resulting from the entitlement to daycare and yet an overall shortage of supply. The supplier, that is the ECEC provider, of a most wanted service could and can in that case choose whom to enroll, or if we put it that way, whom to grant the service. On the one end of the spectrum, there are those center managers who particularly dislike enrollment processes and enrollment times because these entail having to choose some children and families and at the same time having to reject a usually just as high number of families, very well knowing that those needs deserve and demand daycare just as much as the others do. One interviewee stated, "I wish I could take them all," adding that it just didn't feel right having to choose and pick, but that it was something that had to be done. Other interviewees emphasized that having a choice meant to center managers that they could and should thoroughly check if children fit in. That way, they could try to match children and their families to the existing clientele as well as the team in a way. For example, a center manager stressed that she thoroughly checked if the team was well trained and experienced enough to take on children with special needs or certain family backgrounds such as flight and migration. And only if that was the case, she would enroll those children. Looking at our results, we claim that this strongly indicates that segregation in ECEC partly is done through the seemingly simple act of enrolling new students. Interestingly, the providers choosing, though, is not yet taken into account in research much. So what we would like to stress is the need to take research on segregation in ECEC beyond the important focus on parental choice and include provider choice as well. Furthermore, though we would like to suggest that sufficient research on segregation in ECEC needs to take into account all three actors in the ECEC distribution angle and hence certainly needs to include the legally responsible provider in any analysis as well. To support this and to end our short presentation, I will finally shed light on two out of many more interesting findings. Firstly, regarding the relation between the legally responsible provider and parents, I would like to highlight and problematize one facet regarding demand registration modes that are in place. Not yet a whole decade ago, municipalities and usually big cities started implementing childcare online portals, in German Kita-Portale. This would not be interesting as such, taking into account digitalization trends, but When taking a closer look at those websites, one realizes that not all of those provide their services in other languages than German. So it must be well assumed that persons who do not understand or speak German well enough to follow the instructions are excluded, might miss dates, register rather late, do not really know how to register with particular ECEC providers or how to register their demand at all, and hence how to force their child's entitlement to childcare into action. Those families and children, we may well assume, might enter the education system rather late. And in addition, and linked to this, those families might find their way into childcare particularly via peer contact and recommendation, which in effect may result in socially accumulated clienteles and hence segregation. Secondly, in Germany, subsidiarity is a highly regarded principle in politics and policy. In ECEC, this results in a heterogeneous and complex childcare market because the legally responsible provider must promote ECEC providers rather than and before even stepping in providing for childcare themselves. Mostly, the demand cannot entirely be met by private bodies, so it is very common that state authorities, that is municipalities or cities, do step in as daycare providers. Municipalities hence are often in a dual role. In particular, bigger cities did and still do have a right to have a problem to meet the demand. Yet the entitlement to childcare is in place, so parents have a right to be offered a childcare spot. Parents can file a lawsuit and can be refunded their loss of earnings if they cannot get back to work due to the need to care for their child themselves rather than taking on a childcare service. In particular, our interviews from municipalities describe the challenge of dealing with highly educated parents who file a lawsuit or intend to do so. In order to prevent court procedures, it seems that some parents who, as one interviewee stated, know their way, are in a way favored over others who have registered their demand and are inscribed in waiting lists too. On the other hand, the legally responsible providers have to fulfill the task of advising and counseling regarding ECEC. Usually this is provided through consulting hours at the Youth Welfare Office. Interviewees claimed that it is common for counselors to be confronted with the immediate need to find childcare places for families, sometimes those who failed using the online portal. In that case, the legally responsible provider might particularly address their own municipal daycare providers and hence promote segregation or accumulated clienteles as well. All in all, our research, it already proves fruitful to work with the ECEC distribution triangle schema. It visualizes the aim to prevent segregation in ECEC should be addressed by looking at segregation as process as well as result of causes of actions of childcare providers as well as parents and legally responsible providers. We thank you very much for your attention, and we do hope we were able to stimulate some thought and would very much like to get in touch with fellow researchers working on the same subject. Please do contact us if you have questions you would like to discuss with us, or if you have any information you would like to share. We are looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.